Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Just a little review, very little review, I promise. Last week we ended at verse 5, but the first four verses had to do with Paul. First of all, just as a big broad review, 1 Corinthians is a letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and he is in the process of telling them all the things they're doing wrong in their worship and in their dealings with church members and the way they act, their behavior, and all that. So this letter is really, if you read it the right way, it's a pretty tough letter for them. And I think I'm saying this for a fact, that the second letter, in the 2 Corinthians, he wrote an apology for being so hard on them in the first letter, but only because they deserved it. So that's just kind of a broad brush overview. But the first four verses, the first issue that Paul deals with is the issue of factions within the church. And the thing that we talked about last week was that it's not just the fact that there are factions where they have different groups of people within the church that are saying that they're following various other people. They're picking leaders, and for one says, I follow Paul, one says, I follow Cephas, one says, I follow Apollos, and one says, I follow Christ. Well, right away when you see somebody saying, I follow Christ, you say, why would you be following anybody else? Well, that's Paul's point. And he talks to them when he gets into those verses. He really starts insulting them. It's pretty much an insult. He says, I can't talk to you like you were spiritual, like you're Christian, because you act worldly. That's a pretty tough thing to say. And he's talking to a church full of Christians. He's not disputing whether they're Christian or not. They're spirit-filled. They've had all the experiences that a Christian should have. They've had expressed faith in Christ that makes them a Christian. But he says you act worldly, and I can't talk to you like a Christian. So that's basically what those first four verses are talking about, and he's just really all over them. And in verse 5, he says this, what after all is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned each to his task. Now, we covered that verse last week, but basically he says, what is Apollos? What is Paul? He doesn't say who is Apollos, who is Paul. He says what. I would rather be called a who. If you're talking about me, I would rather be called a who. He calls them a what. What is Paul? What is Apollos? He's not talking about the man specifically. He's talking about their function. One is Paul is a church planter. He plants churches. Apollos, we're going to see when we get into the next few verses that Apollos is the one that makes the church grow. He's the basic teacher of the church once it gets started. So they have different functions. You got no reason to follow one over the other, because they both have the same job to do. So that's what he's talking about when he says, what is Paul, what is Apollos? And he said the Lord has assigned each one to the task. So if God assigns a task to each of these men, you have no reason to be following one over the other. God assigns people with their task. You need to be following Christ. These guys are just workers in the field that we're going to be seeing as we go into these next few verses. All right, so let's start with verse 6 to kind of catch us, get going in the right direction. Let me read verse 6 through 9. Let me read 5 through 9. What after all is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it to grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Okay, here's what he said. The guy who does the planting is Paul. His job is evangelism. He's the one that went out where there was nothing and started the church. Then once the church is started, Apollos is the guy that is there continuing to teach and preach and make the church grow. So he's the one that's watering what Paul planted. And then who's the guy that's the most important? God that makes things grow. So without the watering and the planting, it takes all three. You know, God allows us to plant. God allows us to water and work with him. We're going to see as we go through this. But he is the one that makes things happen. And the field that all this stuff gets planted in, we're going to see is the church. Okay, so Paul uses an agricultural metaphor to make the point. Paul makes the point that there are different activities that lead to the growth of the church, and one is not more important than the other, with the exception of God, the one who makes things grow. Okay. There is unity of purpose among the laborers, the one who plants and the one who waters. It takes both of these guys. Okay, there's a unity there. It's not like a union, like these guys do the planting, these guys do the watering, but there's a unity of effort in getting this process of the church to grow. The Corinthians had gotten bogged down in unhealthy allegiances meaning factions development. I've kind of already mentioned that again. It's an unhealthy situation in a church. We've talked about these drapes in here before. You know, they would be the guys that are arguing over what color drapes to hang in the classroom. One guy says, I'm tired of orange, I want red. Then you get another group of guys saying, I want blue. Then you got one guy says, I like it just like it is, orange. Why do we even need to change it? So everybody just kind of gets in line. They're not talking about drapes. They're talking about things that are much more important than that, but just by way of illustration. And it's a point of pride where they will never come to any agreement on it because of that very fact. They're prideful and arrogant. They don't want the other side to win. That's what makes it unhealthy. Okay, it's like arguing with somebody and never coming to agreement on anything. They just are there, and that's the kind of factions that we're talking about. It's an unhealthy situation. Paul indicates two of those factions, those who follow Paul and those who follow Apollos, are creating those allegiances to pride and arrogance. Paul points out the allegiances are misplaced, for Paul and Apollos are completely united in mind and thought, and I am sure that wouldn't be the mind and thought of Christ. We talked about the attitude of Christ when we studied Philippians. Go to Philippians 2, verse 4 through 8. It refers to the attitude of Christ, the mind of Christ. How did Christ think? He thought in terms of humility and servanthood, and if you are humble, you can't be humble and prideful at the same time. Prideful means I'm going to stand my ground, I'm not giving in on anything. Humble says I can work with you, we can come to a good conclusion to what it is that we're trying to get done here. So Paul attributes their allegiances to pride and arrogance. He points out the allegiances that are misplaced. I already said that. So it goes down to the mind of Christ is where they should be. Let me read the last half of verse 8 again. It says, well, let me read all of 8. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor. Very interesting. Each will be rewarded according to his own labor. I used to have fits. I've been teaching since I was 20 years old. And up until we concluded our study of Revelation, I didn't know how to teach these kinds of verses because the New Testament is loaded with this kind of verse. They would be rewarded according to their efforts, according to their work. That's not work for salvation, it's work for Christ. They're going to be rewarded for that, and where are they going to be rewarded for it? If you read it, if you just take an earthly view of this, say, well, I do more in church than he does, and I do more than he does, I should be rewarded more in the church for that. That's not what it's talking about, because there's lots of people that do more work than others, and it just seems like they stay in the same place in the church. They're maybe not even recognized for what they do. So where are they rewarded? Heaven. And they say, well, man, that's a long time to wait. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Like right now. How about right now? This is the note that I put together on the Judgement Seat of Christ. Have y'all ever heard of that? The Judgment Seat of Christ? You never talk about it, right? You never hear about it. The Bema seat is as close as you will get to hearing that term in the Bible, the Bema seat. Okay, the Judgment Seat of Christ. Here's what Romans 14:10 through 12 says. For we all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me, every tongue will acknowledge me. So then each of us will give account of ourselves to God. At some point, not in our lifetime, but after our lifetime, we will stand before Christ and give accounting of our life. Not for judgment. If you have accepted, y'all three are in here, I'm assuming that you've already accepted Christ as your Savior based on faith, not on works, but on faith. So you are saved. Every person in this room is saved. I made sure of that. I talked to them from the class to make sure, see where I am when I start teaching. Each will stand before God, and each will give account of themselves to God. All right, now listen to this. This judgment is an appraisal of work. It's an appraisal of works. You're going to stand before God, and you're going to give accounting of your life. And this is part of it. You're going to be rewarded for your work. Now here's what happens. The judgment is an appraisal of works, but not for purposes of determining salvation. You're already saved, right? Technically, Paul says that everything is available to the Christian. He can do anything he wants, but everything is not beneficial. But you're still saved. These guys in Corinth, he makes no question about stating they are Christians. He calls them brothers all the way through there. So he believes they're saved. All right? So what about this reward? As already stated, our salvation is set before we die, and it is based on our faith in Christ. This judgment measures our level of faithfulness to Christ as we lived out our lives. The result of his judgment determines the level of our reward in heaven. This is so neat. This does not mean as the various floors of a building. You get a level. You've heard of heaven has different levels. It's not like floors in a building. It's levels of responsibility and work that you're going to get to do when you're in heaven. We'll still be human in heaven. We'll all have jobs to do, and our reward is going to be based on our faithfulness to Christ while we were alive on earth. That's what we're going to be judged on. Not for salvation, but for rewards. This is what we're talking about. Paul talks in places about running a race, trying to win the race. Well, he's already saved. How does a teacher teach that verse? He's already saved. What's he going to win? He's going to win approval of Christ for his faithfulness on earth for the job that he's done. He's going to be rewarded for that in heaven. Am I right? So two guys work side by side in church. Some effort is time and expense, yet one guy gets bigger and more influential jobs while the other seems to stand still. I think I already kind of talked around this. You get two guys work, even in your company. You get two guys putting out the same effort in the company. One rises and one seems to not change. Same way in the church. It's not like we're working for recognition, but a lot of guys will work real hard. They're doing the same job that another guy is. One gets recognized and moves up, another one doesn't. It's not that kind of reward. If it was, those guys would move up together. Those kind of rewards are, what would you call it? Praises of men kind of rewards. We're talking about rewards in heaven. That's what he's talking about in that verse. Paul had also used the metaphor of receiving a crown and completing a race. It's all about the Bema seat. It's about the Judgement Seat of Christ.
Why do you keep saying the Bema seat?
That's what it's called. The Hebrew is the Bema seat. In the Old Testament, it's called
Spell that.
B-E-M-A.
What?
B-E-M-A.
Seat.
Yeah, the Bema seat. And so in spiritual situation, if you hear Bema seat, that's what it's talking about. It's talking about judgment for rewards. It's talking about the saved that are not motivated by the praises of men, not saying I'm going to work harder than anybody else in church. They're motivated by the love of Christ. That's what we're talking about. We're not saying I'm trying to aspire to be the greatest Christian that's ever lived. I'm just trying to aspire to the level that Jesus wants me to aspire to because of my love for him. And that's what it's all about. But there are rewards. Make no mistake about that. But even if you go into Isaiah, it talks about his government knows no bounds. It's going to be everywhere, into the universe. I mean, it's a hard thing to grasp. It may be into the universe, into other planets. It could be anywhere. I heard, not Charles Stanley, but Dr. Jeffers talking about that very thing. It knows no bounds. It's going to grow infinitely. It will know no bounds. I mean, it's going to grow into infinity. So by definition, it knows no bounds. And we're going to be always learning. We're going to be always doing. We're going to be always busy. But we're going to have different jobs, no question about it. And it's going to be based on our rewards. And we will all be perfectly happy. Perfectly happy. No jealousy. Say, man, I wish if I had just taught one more lesson, maybe I could have moved up just a little bit more to get me out. See, that's not part of it. It's real rewards. Real rewards. I mean, it's something that's pure. Pure reward. Okay, let's look at verse 9 again. Verse 9 says, "For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." So Paul and Apollos are by extension, we are God's fellow workers. Now I want to make something perfectly clear here before we go too far. We belong to God, right? No argument there. We are fellow workers with each other and with God to the extent that we work under his direction. Servants are not co-workers with their master.
You're not the boss.
We're not the boss. God is in control, and he allows us to work with him, or actually work under him. We're not co-workers with God.
He's the boss of us.
Yeah. More than that even, he's our owner. He owns us. He is our Elohim. I think that means owner, master. Nevertheless, we, the church, are God's field, meaning the church belongs to God, his possession. So we're the field. That's the church, where the planting and the watering is done and all the growing is done. Okay, verse 10 and 11. Let me read those. This is the foundation for the church, is Jesus Christ. It gets really, really cool right here. Verse 10 and 11. "By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ." Now we're going to go verse 10 through 17, or one unit. We're going to, those verses are just really cool. Okay, God extends His grace to Paul when He saved him, right? If you are saved, it's because God extended His grace to you. Grace means favor, undeserved, unmerited favor, something given by the one who has the power to give it. You gotta understand that. I can show grace to somebody, for something. Somebody crossing the street and I show grace to help them. It's not that kind of grace. I have the power to give that grace, okay? Only God has the power and authority to give the kind of grace that we're talking about here. And He extended it to Paul, and He extended it to us so that we might be saved. Here, He further extends His grace to Paul in calling him to preach to the Gentiles. That's what we're talking about here. He said, by the grace God has given me. He first showed him grace to be saved, then He showed him grace to call him to the Gentiles. That's where we are. Under that grace, Paul laid a foundation as an expert builder. There's no explanation for that. He laid the foundation. And that foundation is what? It said that. Jesus Christ. The foundation is Jesus Christ. Paul goes on to say that every builder or worker for Christ should be careful or attentive about how he builds on that foundation. Now that is interesting to me. Didn't he actually physically just say it literally that way? But each one should be careful how he builds. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. Be careful how you build on it. Now we're going to find out exactly what he means by that. Be careful. That's a warning. Paul said he laid the foundation and someone else will build on it, meaning those who come after him. Apollos is one. Paul laid the foundation for Christ in the Corinthian church. There was no church before he got there. He laid the foundation in Jesus Christ. Any other worker later, it's all those that come after Paul. It's you and me. All of us are building on the foundation of Jesus Christ. And we need to be careful how we build. Remember verse 6, we go back to this. Paul planted, Apollos watered, God provided the growth. The word careful, he said be careful how you build. The word careful is a warning which is related to pay and reward at Judgment Day, to be discussed in just a little bit later. All right, verse 11. Let me read verse 11 again. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ.
But he just said he laid a foundation.
Yep. They did not know who Jesus was before Paul got there. He preached the word to them. They got saved. So there's their foundation. They were in a world full of paganism. So there were foundations already there based on other things. Pagan gods, pagan beliefs, pagan this, pagan that. Now there's Muslim beliefs. Now there's Hindu beliefs. We're talking about Jesus Christ is the only foundation for salvation, the only foundation. What could be said of any other foundation outside of Jesus Christ? What could you say about any foundation? I'm going to open this up as an open-ended question. Just tell me what you think. What could you say about any foundation outside of Jesus Christ? I said Muslim is one foundation. Hindu is one. There's many other paganisms. Those are pagan religions too. But what could you say about any other foundation other than Jesus Christ? They don't have a living God, for sure.
They don't have an eternal hope.
They don't have an eternal hope. What else could you say?
It may improve their quality of life in this life, but there's no life to follow.
if you were Muslim, if you're living in a Muslim country, you're going to go further in the business world if you were Muslim. If you are not Muslim, you're not going anywhere. So, yeah, what you're saying is right. In this life, you might be able to, depending on where you live, to be able to move up in the world, get a better paying job, make more money, whatever. Any other foundation other than Jesus Christ is non-Christian. It is non-Christian. And we go back to Revelation 17, I probably will not be able to go more than a few weeks at a time without me mentioning Revelation 17 to you. But that talks about the apostate church. It's about a church in the end times that looks Christian. It professes Christianity. Remember what it said? It said that it looked. I don't remember exactly how it said it, but it looked Christian. It purported to be Christian, but it's apostate, meaning it was not.
Calls itself Christian, but is not.
It is not what it purports to be. We are Christian. I can think of lots of instances today where that's true. But the only foundation, true foundation, is Jesus Christ.
So there can be an apostate church, can there be an apostate person?
Absolutely. The leader of that church, for sure.
There's just people walking around.
Actually, I don't know if that's true or not. I'm gonna back up on that because I'd have to think about that, because apostate means falling away, means it was once and it is not now. Okay? I don't know that a Christian could ever fall away, but a church could be Christian at one time, and then over time you allow beliefs of the world to creep into it and it becomes unchristian. Paul preached to the Galatians. He said, "Oh, foolish Galatians." He called them foolish Galatians. They were letting other things into the church, and he said, any other gospel besides Jesus Christ alone is no gospel at all. So they started out Christian, and then they started letting these things come in. He warned them, you're on your way to becoming apostate. I never thought about saying it that way before, but that's what he's talking about, Wayne. If you continue on the path you're going back to where you came from. You're getting away from Christ. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about one foundation is Christ. If you add something else to it, you're not building on the foundation of Christ. All right. Keep going. Verse 12 through 15 are very interesting, and this is kind of what this day is about. These 4 verses, 12, 13, 14, these 4 verses. These verses have to do with eschatology. All right, here's the word. I put this up here because we're going to be hearing this many times. We've already heard it many times. When Paul talks about the message he preached, it's always Christ crucified. So when you see him talking about the message by which you were saved, the message by which we preached, those things, that's the answer. So if I give you a pop question sometime, do like we used to do, look on the board first. Yeah, look on the board first for the answer, and there it is. If I say message, or by which you were saved, it's Christ crucified. Okay, he's talking about, these 4 verses have to do with eschatology. Eschatology is the study of the end times, like Revelation. It's the study of the end times. Eschatological means something concerning the end times. Okay? Something that we're talking about that concerns the end times, something that happens in the end times, which is this right here. He said in verse 12, I hadn't read those to you yet. Let me get back on where I was. The verse should remove. Okay, these verses should remove any inclination on us to judging whether a professing Christian with a misdirected lifestyle is really Christian. That's what we're looking at here. You've seen guys, we've talked about guys that got saved and you saw no change in their life. And you're saying, was that guy really saved? I'm saying, I don't know anymore. I used to make judgments on that. I can't possibly know whether he was or not because I don't know his heart. So we're going to go through these verses. We'll talk about it as we go. We will see references in these verses to two types of structures. One with a foundation of wood, hay, and stubble. I think of the big bad wolf. When I saw that building with wood, hay, and stubble, I will huff and puff. I can blow your house down. That's not much of a foundation. Not if you can blow it down, or you can burn it up with fire just like that. The other one is one that's made with gold, silver, and precious stones. It's a pretty formidable difference in pictures, right? One is pretty formidable, the other is pretty rickety looking. Okay, then the result, to listen to the result, I'm going to read to you verse 12 through 15 all at one time, and then we'll go back and talk about it. 12 through 15. They shouldn't have left so early. Okay, if any man builds on this foundation, what was the foundation? Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation of Jesus Christ, using gold, silver, and costly stones, wood, hay, or straw. If you look at King James, it says stubble. I really like that, wood, hay, or stubble. His work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. If it is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. Got the flames nipping at his coattails, going through the pearly gates. Okay? All right. Verse 12. The building, let's get this straight. If you say I am building, that means I am doing something. These guys that are building are doing something. They are building. They may be using wood, hay, and stubble, or they may be using gold, silver, and precious stones, but they are doing something. They're not just sitting there saying, well, I wish I had a house that was built. Oh, well, I'll do that tomorrow. They're doing something. They're not just sitting there. They're building. They're expending effort. The references to two types of structures of the gold, silver, and precious stones and the wood, hay, and stubble, both are built on the foundation of Jesus Christ. Both. We've got to get that straight. This is not a guy that just, the guy using wood, hay, or stubble, in your mind's eye, you're probably thinking, I think he's not Christian. But he is Christian. He's building on the foundation of Christ. He's just not doing it the right way. He's using wood, hay, and stubble where he should be using gold, silver, and precious stones. This is not Muslim. It's not Hindu. It's not things of that sort, but one of Jesus Christ. The foundation is Jesus Christ. Not maybe Jesus Christ, not probably Jesus Christ, but is Jesus Christ. We need to get that straight. The foundation of both of these structures is Jesus Christ. And both of them required effort to build. Which means they were doing something. Building on the same foundation. Remember those factions? I kind of think of them that way. You got the foundation of the church here, but all of a sudden they just go off, just go nutty in the way they start arguing and building barriers between relationships and all that stuff, but they're Christian people. All right, here you got the foundation of Christ, building on that, going up with two structures. Verse 13, let me read that again. 13 says this. Well, let me read 12 and 13. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or stubble, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. The quality of each man's work is shown in the foundation he built. I mean, what he built on the foundation of Christ. The walls. Let's look at the walls. The judgment of his work is shown on the day. The evaluation of that work is shown on the day. That's a capital D. That is Judgment Day. It is presumably the second coming of Christ. That's when Judgment Day is, right? That's one Judgment Day. That testing will be done metaphorically with fire. You got a building with wood, hay, and stubble, and you got a building with gold, silver, and precious stone. You apply a little fire to the wood, hay, and stubble. Get some weenies, some coat hangers, and you can roast some weenies on that thing as it burns up. It's not formidable at all. It's not, cannot stand the test. You got the gold, silver, and precious stones, and if anything, if it was hot enough to melt the gold, it's even going to purify the gold. If it was not pure gold, it'll purify that gold. So you got two different situations there. All right. So the testing shows the work for what it is. Verse 14 says this: if what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. That's a pretty short verse. If what he built, if what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. Well, he's going to receive a reward. We're talking, both of these are Christian people. The guys building with wood, hay, and stubble, and the guys building with gold, silver, and precious stones are Christian. They're building on Christ's foundation of Jesus Christ. So there's going to be a reward. And it's the kind of reward at Judgment Day is this Judgment Seat of Christ thing. It's the evaluation of their work. The guys that did the better job. There might even have been a group in there in the reality of it all. There might be a group in there that mixed in the gold, silver, and precious stones with some wood, hay, and stubble, trying to build a pretty good building at a lower cost. You know, add a little wood, hay, and stubble to it, or don't reinforce that concrete with quite the same quality of rebar. You know, whatever. They're all going to be evaluated on the day, the D-A-Y, the capital D-A-Y.
Yeah, why is it capital?
It's Judgment Day. It's the day when the Judgment Seat of Christ is going. You're going to be found to be standing before the Judgment Seat of Christ, and He's going to say, "Tell me how you built that building." Yes, sir.
Does this involve fruits of the Spirit?
Oh man, I don't know. Probably does. It involves everything.
I thought it was in other words of Jesus.
Well, it's an evaluation of your life. It is everything, even things that you don't even remember as being significant. It's going to be your motives mainly. It's going to be your motives for the things you did. Let's go back to the working in the church. See, I want this job. I really want to lead this effort because in your heart, not outwardly, but in your heart, you're thinking, I'm going to get a lot of respect out of this one. Nobody wanted this job. If I do a good job,
It's gonna make me look good.
I'm going to look good. That's not a very good motive.
No, but
You ought to be saying, I want to do this because of the love of Christ. You know, we're human. You can't help but have unspiritual, worldly kinds of thoughts because of your human nature, your sinful nature. But that nature is going to be involved in the judgment. You're right. I mean, you start out, I think of Romans 7. When I hear that kind of thing right there, I think of Romans 7. Paul says, I find myself doing the very thing I said I did not want to do. That's what he said. That's called sin. Start out with pure intentions, and then you get further along and you see what kind of success is coming of this. They're saying,
There's still a precious stone involved.
yeah, there is.
That will persevere.
And that's what she's talking about. There's good that comes out of it, and your motive. I'm guessing your motives flip flop in there. They change from perfect to not perfect, and go back and forth and back and forth. And maybe one time you're saying, "I wish I'd never even said I would do this." So But that's what we're talking about. It's an evaluation, it's an appraisal of your whole life. Everything you have ever done, the reason you did everything you did, the reasons you didn't do some things that you should have done, it's all going to be there. And that's what this house is that we're talking about. Okay. Then 15 comes in there. Verse 15 says this. If it is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. The worker is Christian. These workers are Christian. And since the time I wrote these notes until today, I have changed my mind as to what I want to tell you. I'm going to tell you both. Here's what I wrote. The worker is Christian. He built on the foundation of Christ, but his motives for his works and the quality of his works are judged to be insufficient for reward. He's going to heaven. He's saved. It's just he didn't quite cut the mustard on motives. The quality of his work is motives is what I'm talking about. Now, I think he will always have a reward if he's Christian, if he is building something. See, I think there's a Christian here that's not included in this. You know, you can look at the guy that built with wood, hay, and stubble, and I used to think that was the guy that got saved and then did nothing, not one blooming thing to change. Was his life changed in any way whatsoever? The guy still goes to heaven if he was sincerely making that profession of faith. That's the guy I thought this was talking about. Now, I'm not so sure that guy is in this part of the scripture. I'm thinking the guy that made the profession of faith, and he had enough gumption to build a building, to expend some effort. Wrong motives notwithstanding, he did expend some effort. He did make a change in his life, and he built something. It just wasn't adequate for what Jesus was looking for perfectly. And you're saying, well, a guy, you know, I'm looking at him saying, I'm not even sure he's a Christian. The way he was acting when he was building that building. This says he was and he will make it to heaven with the flames nipping at his coattail. Ooh, let me get in there while I can. This is pretty powerful scripture right here. And it's not, I mean, it is for us, it is for the world at large, for Christianity at large, but this was for the Corinthian church. That's the initial meeting. He wrote this to the Corinthians. And that, if you were sitting there with these factions, these guys that are arguing about everything, they're lining up, they're prideful, they're selfish, they're arrogant, they're self-exalting, this would just be a slap in your face. Because that's the way he started chapter 3 out. He said, I can't even talk to you about spiritual things in a spiritual way because you're acting worldly. You're too dense to even catch on to what I'm talking about. One thing he'll lose is the reward he thought he's going to get. It's not like he loses necessarily anything on earth, because in the eyes of his fellow church member, he might have been a pretty good guy. In fact, I was one of the guys that lined up behind him. You know, he's leading one of those factions. We thought we were right, without regard to our arrogance, our prideful way of looking things, our selfishness, our self-exaltation. Without regard to any of those things, we were doing a pretty good job. Well, that's what you're going to lose. You're going to be told you weren't doing a very good job. As Jesus appraises your your efforts in your entire life, as it turns out. What else can I say about that? Really good at repeating that. I wanted to go back to something I said last week. I went home with a recording of the lesson, and Jan and I went through it, and I said, it seemed like I just kept saying the same thing over and over and over again. Remember me saying that, Jan? You said, yeah. And I said, well, you know what? Every time, but I want to point out something to you. Every time I said it is because Paul repeated himself. The things I was pointing out to you was important. It was important enough to Paul for him to go over it and over it and over it. And that's what Wayne's talking about. We got right here in this letter, probably a couple of times we've already talked about rewards, maybe even in this chapter a couple of times about rewards. And it's going to be over and again. Further into 1 Corinthians, you get to 2 Corinthians, he's still talking about rewards. So it's a big deal, but it's not rewards that we strive for the praise of men. It's rewards we strive for the love, because of the love of Christ in our life. It's the things that we're just really, really wanting to do. I really want it because I really do want Jesus to say to me, well done, good and faithful servant. I don't want him to be disappointed in any way or shape or fashion. And then when you start talking about that way, then you immediately start finding, dang, I'm human. I'm still human, because my thought starts changing. But I do repeat myself for the same reason, things that I really want you to know and be aware of. Okay. Verse 16 and 17. Yeah, let me read 16 and 17. Do you not know? That's the way my mother used to talk to me at times. Don't you know? Do you not know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. Do you not know? Sounds like an indictment. The church is not just our building. It is holy and valuable. It's not just any building. The church is not just any building. It is holy and valuable. 10 times in 1 Corinthians, he says, do you not know? That sounds like a technique he's mastered. Do you not know? 10 times. It's a rebuke every time. We will see that the Corinthians continually react to building their own, resort to building their own kingdoms. That's what these factions are. These guys are building kingdoms within the church. Happens all the time. You go to a big church, you got a big powerful deacon. Nothing happens around there without him saying, okay, we'll do it, or we won't do it. Or you get a pastor. I don't think of the pastors so much. Sometimes the pastors get the deacons to do the things that he wants done, so he doesn't have to be the one doing it. But it can be that kind of thing. We're talking about kingdom building. These factions, you got 4 guys, 4 different groups. I don't think that the number is necessarily important, but you got these groups of these guys that are building their little kingdoms within the church. What am my notes run together here. Since the Spirit dwells in them, making them the temple of God, exalting anything over God would be desecrating the temple. Anyone who would seek to destroy the church is in peril here. These are not the same people who were building with wood, hay, and stubble. These are not the same people. These are guys, I'm not even sure that they're Christian. You say they can be destroyed. We're promised we're not going to be destroyed. We won't incur the wrath of God if you're a Christian. So this has to be a different group. They're a group that are destroying the church from within. Okay? I want to read something to you. Page 85. Verse 16 and 17 preserve a crucial warning which is not adequately heeded, that the powerful, dynamic church leaders who consistently split congregations, engage in witch hunts and heresy trials against fellow Christians, and in general seek to build their own kingdoms in opposition to, rather than in cooperation with, fellow ministers, may be headed down the road to outright apostasy. Okay? I do not believe they're talking about Christians. I'm talking about guys that get into the church and they start their kingdom building and they start making what started out to look like Christian and turning it, with their personal influence, turned it into something else. Like the Corinthian faction leaders and their groupies, such people and their followers are not usually thought of as Paul's primary candidates for carnality or even eternal condemnation, but in many ways they are the closest modern equivalents to those who went about quarreling and destroying the Corinthian church from within. Even in less extreme cases, Jerry Vines preached at Cliff Temple one time when I was there. This is a long time ago. Jerry Vines' pointed remark rings true. Many people in America today are building crowds but are not willing to pay the price to build a church. That last sentence says it all.
What does that mean?
It means that they're building a church based on entertainment value. There's no blood in the gospel. There's no resurrection in the gospel. It's about coming into the church, raising your hands, singing, giving to the church, hearing a feel-good message about prosperity, and then going home. Christ is not in it, even if his name is in the name of the church. You hear what I'm saying? I've told you Christianity is just a word. It is just a word. It is defined by the person that is using it. He says, I'm a Christian. Well, are you now? Did you accept? Yeah.
Same thing.
Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about people that so this thing about building factions, it's more than just building factions. It's what building factions means. It means putting your values and your ideas and your work and your effort above those of Christ. It's what I want. I'm not stopping till I get those drapes changed. And we're not going to do anything. We're not providing any money for ministry. I'm a head deacon, and I'm telling you, nothing's happening around here till those drapes get changed.
Stripes.
Yeah, we want that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Okay, verse 18. 18. Do not deceive yourselves. Now, what verse do you think I'm going to pull in here, Wayne? Do not deceive yourselves. If any one of you thinks he is wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool, so that he may become wise. 18 through 23 is a new section. He's getting back to the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world. Do not deceive yourselves. Do not forget Jeremiah 17, verses 9 through 10. Let me read it to you. It's one of our verses up there. You'll be wise to never forget this verse. Jeremiah 17. Isaiah. The heart is deceitful above all things. You want to get to it, Wayne? I'm not rushing you. Do not deceive yourselves, is what he said in verse 18. Do not deceive yourselves. And I thought immediately about this verse. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Those guys, those deacons that are building their little empires, think they're doing the right thing. They think, I follow Christ. That's only because their heart deceives them. If they could stand off here at, from 30,000 feet and look down on the situation like God does, they'd say, well, it's obviously you're not following Christ. Their hearts are deceitful, and our hearts are deceitful as Christian people. Our hearts can be deceitful.
And the next verse goes to the
Oh,
what we
yeah.
were talking about earlier.
Let's look at it. Let's look at that next verse. Verse 10 says, I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind. The mind is what hardens the heart, by the way. I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind, to reward a man according to his conduct, according to what his deeds deserve. Not by what he thinks he deserves, because he thinks he deserves a lot because he has a heart that's deceived himself. You're getting my honest appraisal. That's what you get. Okay, the reference goes back to verse 118 in 1 Corinthians. Verse 118 is a powerful verse. We're going to be seeing it before we get through. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The people that are perishing look at the gospel of Jesus Christ and say, that is ridiculous. They are dying and they do not even know it. Don't deceive yourselves. Verse 19 and 20 says this. Where am I? 19:20. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness, and again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. Those two quotes come from Job 5:13 and Psalm 94:11. There's a footnote in my Bible that says that, but the commentary said it also. It's pretty obvious. God cannot be fooled. You can't be fooled. These guys are building their empires. Some of them do it willingly and knowingly that it's not the Christian thing to do. Others are Christians and not realize what they're doing. God will not be fooled. He searches the hearts, what verse 10, Jeremiah 17:10 says. We could go back and look at it, but we won't. All right, verse 21 and 22, which is the end of this chapter, I might add. 21 and 22 says this. So then, no more boasting about men. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, remember those are three of the four at the beginning, or the world, or life, or death, or the present, or the future. All are yours, and you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. No more boasting about men, for all things belong to those who are in Christ. Those four groups are like these two guys right here. They should be like these two guys right here. They are all doing the work of Christ. They weren't. They were doing their own work. But all things belong to all people that are in Christ. He does one job, he had another. But it's all because they were working for the mind of Christ. They do not belong to human leaders. They belong to God in Christ. I covered some